Chapter 32 of A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jude Cater. A Short Life of Abraham Lincoln by John G. Nicolay. Chapter 32. The Bogus Proclamation. The Wade-Davis Manifesto. Resignation of Mr. Chase. Fessenden succeeds him. The Greeley Peace Conference. Jaques Gilmore Mission. Letter of Raymond. Bad outlook for the election. Mr. Lincoln on the issues of the campaign. President's secret memorandum. Meeting of Democratic National Convention. McClellan nominated. His letter of acceptance. Lincoln re-elected. His speech on night of election. The electoral vote. Annual message of December 6, 1864. Resignation of McClellan from the army. The seizure of the New York Journal of Commerce and New York World in May 1864 for publishing a forged proclamation calling for 400,000 more troops had caused great excitement among the critics of Mr. Lincoln's administration. The terrible slaughter of Grant's opening campaign against Richmond rendered the country painfully sensitive to such news at the moment, and the forgery, which proved to be the work of two young bohemians of the press, accomplished its purpose of raising the price of gold and throwing the stock exchange into a temporary fever. Telegraphic announcement of the imposture soon quieted the flurry, and the quick detection of the guilty parties reduced the incident to its true rank. But the fact that the fiery Secretary of War had meanwhile issued orders for the suppression of both newspapers and the arrest of their editors was never forgiven nor forgotten. The editors were never incarcerated, and the journals resumed publication after an interval of only 2 days. But the incident was vigorously employed during the entire summer as a means of attack upon the administration. Violent opposition to Mr. Lincoln came also from those members of both houses of Congress who disapproved his attitude on Reconstruction. Though that part of his message on December 8, 1863, relating to the formation of loyal state governments in districts which had been in rebellion, at first received enthusiastic commendation from both conservatives and radicals, it was soon evident that the millennium had not yet arrived, and that in a Congress composed of men of such positive convictions and vehement character, there were many who would not submit permanently to the leadership of any man, least of all to that of one so reasonable, so devoid of malice, as the President. Henry Winter Davis at once moved that that part of the message be referred to a special committee of which he was chairman, and on February 15 reported a bill whose preamble declared the Confederate States completely out of the Union, prescribing a totally different method of reestablishing loyal state governments, one of the essentials being the prohibition of slavery. Congress rejected the preamble, but after extensive debate accepted the bill, which breathed the same spirit throughout. The measure was also finally acceded to in the Senate, and came to Mr. Lincoln for signature in the closing hours of the session. He laid it aside and went on with other business, despite the evident anxiety of several friends, who feared his failure to endorse it would lose the Republicans many votes in the Northwest. In stating his attitude to his cabinet, he said, "This bill and the position of these gentlemen seem to me, in asserting that the insurrectionary States are no longer in the Union, to make the fatal admission that States, whenever they please, may of their own motion dissolve their connection with the Union. Now we cannot survive that admission, I am convinced, If that be true, I am not President. These gentlemen are not Congress. I have laboriously endeavored to avoid that question ever since it first began to be mooted, and thus to avoid confusion and disturbance in our own councils. It was to obviate this question that I earnestly favored the movement for an amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery, which passed the Senate and failed in the House. I thought it much better, if it were possible, to restore the Union without the necessity of a violent quarrel among its friends as to whether certain States have been in or out of the Union during the war, a merely metaphysical question, and one unnecessary to be forced into discussion. But though every member of the cabinet agreed with him, he foresaw the importance of the step he had resolved to take, and its possible disastrous consequences to himself. When someone said that the threats of the radicals were without foundation, and that the people would not bolt their ticket on a question of metaphysics, he answered, "If they choose to make a point upon this, I do not doubt that they can do harm. They have never been friendly to me. At all events, I must keep some consciousness of being somewhere near right. I must keep some standard or principle fixed within myself." Convinced, after fullest deliberation, that the bill was too restrictive in its provisions, and yet unwilling to reject whatever of practical good might be accomplished by it, he disregarded precedents, and acting on his lifelong rule of taking the people into his confidence, issued a proclamation on July 8, giving a copy of the bill of Congress, reciting the circumstances under which it was passed, and announcing that while he was unprepared by formal approval of the bill to be inflexibly committed to any single plan of restoration, or to set aside the free State governments already adopted in Arkansas and Louisiana, or to declare that Congress was competent to decree the abolishment of slavery, yet he was fully satisfied with the plan as one very proper method of reconstruction, and promised executive aid to any State that might see fit to adopt it. The great mass of Republican voters, who cared little for the metaphysics of the case, accepted this proclamation, as they had accepted that issued 6 months before, as the wisest and most practicable method of handling the question. But among those already hostile to the President, and those whose devotion to the cause of freedom was so ardent as to make them look upon him as lukewarm, the exasperation which was already excited increased. The indignation of Mr. Davis and of Mr. Wade, who called the bill up in the Senate, at seeing their work thus brought to nothing, could not be restrained, and together they signed and published in the New York Tribune of August 5 the most vigorous attack ever directed against the President from his own party, insinuating that only the lowest motives dictated his action, since by refusing to sign the bill he held the electoral votes of the rebel States at his personal dictation, calling his approval of the bill of Congress as a very proper plan for any State choosing to adopt it a studied outrage, and admonishing the people to consider the remedy of these usurpations, and having found it, to fearlessly execute it. Congress had already repealed the fugitive slave law, and to the voters at large, who joyfully accepted the Emancipation Proclamation, it mattered very little whether the institution came to its inevitable end, in the fragments of territory where it yet remained, by virtue of congressional act or executive decree. This tempest over the method of Reconstruction had, therefore, little bearing on the presidential campaign, and appealed more to individual critics of the President than to the mass of the people. Mr. Chase entered in his diary, "The President pocketed the great bill. He did not venture to veto, and so put it in his pocket. It was a condemnation of his amnesty proclamation and of his general policy of Reconstruction, rejecting the idea of possible Reconstruction with slavery, which neither the President nor his chief advisers have, in my opinion, abandoned." Mr. Chase was no longer one of the chief advisers. After his withdrawal from his hopeless contest for the presidency, his sentiments